Okay, well, welcome everybody. Let me go ahead and hit with the week's solar news. And actually, for the first time, March of this year, 100% of all of the additional generating capacity on the grid came from solar and wind. So during the first quarter of 2022, 97.4% of all grid addition generating capacity is wind and solar. So only 2.6% came from natural gas. That kicks up to 26.4% of the capacity is now from renewables. It eclipsed coal at 18.2, which is interesting because I think it was only a year or two ago that those two were equal. Nuclear is down to 8.2% of the grid capacity. Natural gas still is the big gun with 43.9% of the generating capacity on the grid. But the high probability projections are showing that renewables will generate about a third of the grid capacity by 2025. And even West Virginia, they just put out a bid for 50 megawatts of solar. So Joe Manchin country is coming around to solar. And in what I like to call what could possibly go wrong, ERCOT has announced that the grid in Texas has never been more reliable, and they anticipate zero problems over the summer. So how is that?
I thought they announced 2 weeks ago there's supposed to be rolling blackouts. How'd they fix it in 2 weeks?
They didn't. The announcement came right after they announced there would be no problems, and then they had problems, which they defined as low probability events. So that's good. They also announced that they have, and these are again quotes, no concerns at this time about the emergency pricing structure in Texas. They have had a cap that during these emergency periods, they can charge as much as $9,000 per megawatt hour, which is $9 per kilowatt hour. They've reduced that cap to $5 per kilowatt hour. So the problem is solved. And I was looking through some of the headlines, and a lot of people were receiving electric bills that were in the range of $10,000 to $20,000 for the month during the winter blackouts of, was it last year or the year before? Time flies.
The individuals, Jay?
Yeah, individual homes. Yeah, you figure at 9,000 a megawatt hour, that's like a typical suburban home's monthly bill. So if you had that, you would, and if you do use double that, you'd be up to 18,000 bucks for that month. Corporate procurements continue to expand, and this is where companies say they want to meet their goals using renewable energy. 2021 was a record for corporate procurements. That was up 32% from the year before. And this year looks to be breaking 2021's record. And just to let you know that 37% of the additions of renewables on the grid are tracked back to corporate procurement policies. And about half of all of these companies involved in this market in 2021 were new to the market. So a lot of new companies coming in and purchasing renewables there. And a lot of the manufacturing, and I guess I'll give a nod here to Don on this. This is the policy of isolationism and tariffs seeming to work a little bit. A lot of companies are starting to open up plants in the US. Q-Cells has announced they're opening another solar module plant in Dalton, Georgia, going to employ about 470 new people there. Q-Cell is actually now the largest manufacturer of solar panels to the US market. They have a 24% share for the residential market and about 21% for commercial. REC Silicon has reopened a plant in Washington State after getting a $200 million cash infusion from Hanwha Solutions, which is a Korean petrochemical company. And Iguana Energy has opened a battery plant in San Jose, California. But our buddies at Solar Edge decided they were going to open their battery plant in Korea. So assuming South Korea, that's my assumption. And that's the news this week for solar. Couple of things I do have here. There's an NREL webinar tonight. If people are interested, I can send you the link on that. It's about what's new in the world of solar. And if you send a note in the chat wanting these links, give me your email address, because I was getting some in previous where it comes from John and it says, send it to me. So I have no idea where to send. So give me your email. There's a home grid energy storage system webinar recording. So if you're interested in that, I have the link on that. And then Wood Mackenzie just released a white paper talking about protecting solar from cyber attacks. And if you want that, I could send you the link on that. That's really from a utility perspective, primarily, when I looked it through, which is apparently not a theoretical thing. We're talking about these power outages in Texas causing generating plants to go down, but cyber attacks can do the same thing. They can basically emulate a major weather event and cause all these generating stations to shut down. Yeah, Bob.
A couple of years ago, the Russian hacked not only the solar industry, but a lot of industries through solar wind.
Yeah.
They went right through solar wind. And I was one of them. I lost my internet. I had my internet guy look at it and he says, it's totally wiped. He had to reconstruct it from the beginning. And he wouldn't give me a discount.
And Solar Wind was a company, right? It wasn't like through that industry, but yeah, they hacked in
through their website. Through their website.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, there's a annual conference of hackers that meets in Las Vegas, of course. I think they call themselves the Black Hats. And just for fun, from the stage, two teenage guys showed how they could log into Florida's utility grid and took total control over the utility grid in Florida on the stage in like less than 10 minutes. They had control over the grid. So they didn't do anything with it, but that was fun. Okay, well, we have one item that was brought up. And Devanand, is that how you say your first name? Devanand? Yeah, you're on mute. So, yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
We were talking before the session, and you're doing a project there in Trinidad or in Tobago or in one of the islands there. And it's grid connected, but not really grid tied. It's going to operate as a standalone. You said it's going to be in the neighborhood of 300 kilowatts, 250 to 300 kilowatts, and about 800 kilowatt hours of storage capacity. And I was looking for some guidance. This is obviously a big system. And does anybody have any ideas, I guess, of what? Of product, of configuration, of issues you might face, or all of the above? Is this? What are you looking for, Devanand?
Well, product will be one. Product will kind of define the configuration to an extent, I would think. I was looking at SME multi-cluster systems where you can take the PV inverters with an AC coupled system with the storage inverters, and they can build it up under a three-phase environment. They say they can be scaled up to 100 kilowatts or more. But the project is on a lot of land, which is about 300 acres spread. It consists of several buildings, each of them with their own requirements. And therefore, I was initially looking to have something individual for each building. But then the client was asking if you could just put one big system to support the entire infrastructure. So I was kind of looking for ideas how was the best way to go about that, what might be something feasible.
Yeah, I guess my first impression, because I know a lot of times when you do a multi-building site, connecting in to that building can be an issue. So I guess my first impression would be maybe to treat each building as if it were its own thing, its own, because you've got to connect in for that, especially since it's a standalone type system. So I guess my first impression would be to treat it as 4 or 5 separate smaller systems as opposed to
Well-
one large system.
Well, one of the buildings will still require a sizable system, at least maybe about 150 to 200 kilowatts. That's one of the, the others will be smaller, 20, 30, 15 kilowatts, 50, but one of them will be most low load, I say between 150 to 200 kilowatts still.
Mhm. And does anybody have any experience with very large storage systems? I mean, the inverter system doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal because, as you said, you can get some of these commercial inverters that are 100 kilowatts fairly regular, and really you'd only need like 3 inverters. But the question is, I'm just not that familiar with very large battery backup systems. I mean, that's pretty huge. 800 kilowatt hours. You could buy yourself 10 Ford Lightnings and park them in the parking lot and hook them up.
Wouldn't even have to be 10 if you bought the higher end model.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, well, just to give you a lot of perspective in Trinidad and Tobago, the laws in Trinidad does not allow to go grid tie. So we cannot feed into the grid, we can't do self-consumption. And that kind of limits us where solar installations in Trinidad is mainly an off-grid application for the time being. But over the last year or so, we have clients going on these multi-large farming systems, buildings, and they want the entire whole system run on an off-grid application cases. So we have some right now there's another one actually is 120 kilowatts. This is by a company doing what is called a district cooling system, where they generate cold water system at one of the facility plant, run pipes to the surrounding buildings in the area, pump the cold water there on a commercial basis and some arrangement where they charge for it. And they want that whole system being powered by solar. And a company out of Sweden came and looked at it and said, well, to do that, they will probably need like about 120 watts kilowatt PV system. But so if they do implement that, that is still an off-grid application we have to look at with energy storage, because as if they can take from it cannot be done under self-consumption in the sense of grid, because the laws at the moment are just not there in place. The government is looking to change that, but we have no idea in Trinidad when that will happen. So everything is more about energy storage to meet these kind of low demands. So I find myself in the middle with some of these scenarios where, I mean, I've done systems up to about 15 kilowatts, 18 kilowatts, but that's a different kettle of fish we're talking about there from my perspective,
Okay. Well, it doesn't sound, I'm not getting any feedback from folks. I'm afraid you're going to have to be the one who finds the solution and then tells us what these big battery systems are. Because I mean, there are a lot of these systems utility size, and that may be too big for you, but you're probably right in that range that's bigger than a standard commercial, but smaller than a standard utility. Yeah.
Well, I'll try to reach out to SME. Maybe I could talk to one of the tech guys and see if I get some ideas on a solution. I don't know if you anybody here have any contacts with SME. I don't know if Schneider has any solutions to that as well.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any questions to bring up? Any issues that are in the front of your mind? Okay, well, the topic I brought up here today, I was thinking about, since I'm still in the very end of writing the level 2 book, the commercial book, and I was in the commissioning chapter. So thought I'd mention some of the things there. When you install a system, obviously the first time you start it up, it's known as the commissioning process. And there's some steps that you're supposed to go through. And if you've done some small residential type systems, you probably didn't go through all these steps. You turned it on, and if it worked, you figured you were done, and that was good. But with the larger commercial systems, there's some documentation requirements, there's some testing requirements that really should be in there. And actually the go-to document that's out there is the IEC 62446, which is referred to as Grid Connected PV Systems Minimum Requirements for System Documentation, Commissioning Tests, and Inspection. So pretty much the content is in the title. When you go through the commissioning process, you want to make sure that the as-built is similar to what was designed. So that's one of the steps you go through, is make sure all of the things that were actually installed or that are in the plans are reflected in the installation. And of course, you walk through the system. I like to start at the solar panels and then work myself all the way back to the load, just to give a process to it. But you look to make sure all your connections are made. And these are, of course, done typically when everything's in the open or the turned off position. Jiggle some wires, make sure that the connections are firm. So you get that done. You want to make sure everything is code compliant. So you might, for instance, measure spacing, on the edges on a commercial roof or something like that. Make sure all your labels are in place. The labels are always a big issue. Then you want to begin to program the inverter, and that can always be annoyingly long process. Where I like to say we did a system in Pennsylvania where we installed the entire residential system in the morning. And then it took all afternoon to get the inverter programmed and connecting. And so you go through that process. Then you want to, good thing to check, and this is more of an electrician's thing, check that the loads, if this is a load side connection, check that all your loads are balanced. Especially a three-phase system that's running some single phase equipment off the three-phase. And if you've got heavy on one leg of the three-phase system, what ends up happening when that occurs is the neutral is used to balance out these load imbalances. And so you'll have power running through your neutral on the return. And if you do have a ground fault at some point on the neutral, this can have some severe impact. Give you an example on our home. We didn't do any attempt at balancing the loads between the two legs on the single phase system. And then we had a ground fault, a lightning strike that blew out the neutral line coming in from the utility. And immediately what occurred was the voltages on one leg shot up to about 170 volts or so. And then on the other leg, it dropped down to what would be the alternative, 170, about 70 volts. So instead of having 240 coming in, evenly 120 on each line, it was 170 and 70. So any piece of electronics that was connected to the one leg, they fried out. So, well pumps and refrigerators and things like that all fried out. And of course, the other things just browned out, didn't run, whatever. So having the imbalance there can be an issue. Some of the tests that they would recommend, continuity or resistance tests. And that's a good way to just check to make sure your connections have been made. If you can run a continuity test, you're just checking for resistance. If the resistance is infinite, that means there's a break in the line somewhere. Could be a bad fuse, could be a connection that wasn't made properly. You can do polarity testing throughout the DC system. So that's just making sure you didn't somehow mix up the positive with the negative, which would lead to some issues. Clearly, it could be catastrophic for your inverter, for example, but it could just limit the amount of production that's coming out of the system as well. You might want to do some of the voltage and current testing, generating IV curves, either on every single panel or on every single string. I can ask Devanand, when you're doing these projects like the big commercial, do you generate IV curves on each panel or string and then put that in your commissioning documentation?
No, I don't really have an IV curve tester like C1. It's something I have to get for those larger systems. Most of the
Okay.
electrical tests will be done to verify the open circuit, short circuit conditions of match it up to the design to see how it works, and functional test of equipment to see they're working. But we try to follow the same process, starting from the PV and work all the way back all straight to the inverter side of things.
So you're just doing like checking open circuit voltage and making sure that, this string or this panel is functioning about where it should be given the
It
condition.
should be correct. And then we'll do insulation tests on the system.
Yeah.
Polarity testing just to verify everything is done properly. But that's about the range of most of the testing we do with it.
Okay. So when you're saying insulation testing, that's another test where you've got a megometer that you hook up to the system. And because a lot of times when you're pulling wire through the conduit, you can booger up the wire, make little nicks in it, cause problems. So after it's installed, you want to run a megometer or a megger on there.
Yes.
And the way those things operate is you send a high voltage DC current through the wire, and there's a receiver at the other end. You want to make sure it's not connected to any electronics because you might blow things out. And then it'll tell you if there's lost voltage because of bad insulation. It should even tell you where in the system that break is, along, if you've got the right equipment for that. So insulation testing is good. With the IV curves, the unit that you have there typically has a temperature gauge or a sensor that you connect to the back of the panel. And then it's got a clamp that clamps on the front of the panel, and you set it at the angle of incident, of the panel, and it has the irradiance meter, and then you hook everything up to these leads, and then it'll generate an IV curve. And so you could do that and then put that in with your documentation just to show your customer, yeah, I did it. It was all working the way it's supposed to work at the time of commissioning, and later something might happen. And in fact, later I was doing a lot of research on a phenomenon known as PID, P-I-D. That's potential induced degradation. And PID is usually something that only, that we come across in commercial systems primarily, because systems that operate at 600 volts or less are typically not subject to this PID. But what that is basically is after about a week or maybe a month, the actual production of the panel might drop by as much as 80%. So you can see quite a lot of loss of power. So if you've installed a system and then the customer starts to, complain that, all of a sudden it's just working like crap, and they're going to tell you it's all your fault and you shouldn't have done that and you did something wrong. Well, it's a phenomenon that occurs with certain panels, and they are making panels that resist this, but they get they just get a leakage of voltage between the cell and the front glass of the panel, which then bleeds into the frame of the panel. And so a lot of their current is being grounded. So there is a fairly easy fix for this. And if it does occur, you can correct it. They sell these little PID units that you can connect in parallel to your array. And what they'll do is during the day, as the panel is generating power and it goes to the inverter, this PID, can build up. But then at night, this little box disconnects the inverter and then takes a DC voltage at the opposite polarity and feeds it back to the solar panels. And those panels then radiate that out in terms of infrared, just as if it were backfeeding from a battery or something. And that essentially resets the issue. So during the day it builds up, but at night you can correct it and you can recover essentially 100% of the functionality of the panel by incorporating this little PID box, they call them, into the system. So if that ever occurs, that there is a solution to that problem. And you might want to look at making sure in three-phase, the phase rotation test. With grounding systems, you can do a soil resistivity test, where you find out how resistive your soil is. In a lot of jurisdictions, they require that if soil resistivity is below a certain number, you've got to put in a second ground rod. So this is, of course, on residential systems again. So what you would need to do is conduct this test. Well, as a result, most installers in those jurisdictions just put in a second ground rod and bond it together, because installing two ground rods is a lot cheaper than actually conducting the soil resistivity test. So you may find that if you're working in certain jurisdictions, two ground rods are going to be required and bonded together. And then there might be a ground leakage test that you're going to do. Is power leaking out into your grounding system? A certain amount of power leaking into the grounding system is normal, but too much means there's either a ground fault, unbalanced loads somehow that are grounding out through that. There could be a lot of reasons there. So anyway, those are the things I think, as Devin then said, typically you're going to do a visual check, maybe continuity polarity checks, insulation checks. But then some of the other testing is usually for very large systems or if a problem has occurred. So anybody have any comments on that or questions about it?
I have a question. Potential induced degradation. Where is that coming from? It's not like arcing or something, is it?
No, it has something to do, and I don't want to claim that I understand everything about it, but when I was reading these articles, it has to do when you're operating at very high voltage, usually 1,000 volt or greater systems. And it also seems to be worse in high humidity and high temperature environments, and if you've got long strings. And it has something to do with one end of the string somehow creating, there's a buildup of a difference of potential, between the positive and the negative. But it also has to do with the silicon leaking between the glass that it's up against and into the frame. So there are some manufacturers who claim that they've tested their panels to be resistive to PID. And so that's one way of dealing with it, is buy panels that are resistive. And I did notice there are a number of inverter manufacturers now who are putting PID compensation devices within their, within the inverter. So if it's an issue, but this is really a high voltage commercial issue. So if we get into, say if the NEC raises the voltage levels, even on residential, to 1,000 volts or 1,500 volts, we may see this becoming a bigger issue. Any other questions? Yeah, Bill.
Excuse me. I, of course, got this container done with 5,000 watts on the roof. I'm looking actually locating it adjacent to a creek. And the creek water temperature is, I haven't measured it, but I suspect it's 20, 30 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature. And, you know, this is kind of an experiment in low, air conditioning is an issue in Houston, right? You want to stay cool. And I'm actually wondering whether anyone is worked with heat exchangers or anything that where you can pump cold water through a coil and have some fans extract the cool for air conditioning. And I mean, I've just begun to think about it, and I know air conditioning units have coils and have fans and all that stuff, and I may explore that approach, but I just wondered whether anyone else had any experience or thought about it.
If you're gonna discharge warmer water back into that creek, you may get in trouble with some environmental regulations.
Sure, I understand. I mean, it's a trickle.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
nevertheless, yeah, I mean, for that matter, the permitting the container is an issue. I don't want to do a permit just because it's a pain in the rear, but nevertheless.
I know that they have some systems, those heat exchange systems, you know, a basic heat exchanger that uses like either buried coils in the ground, but they also make them to bury those coils in ponds, you know, so you can throw coils in bodies of water as a heat exchange mechanism. I wonder if they make something small. I mean, it sounds like you don't want a whole house heat pump system.
Yeah, well, I had thought that I would just pump the cold water up to the container and somehow extract the cold out of it, rather than having a heat exchanger down in the creek. You know, I mean, that's just more complexity.
Yeah, you're wanting this as a air conditioning unit, not just to cool the panels?
No, not to cool the panels, just to cool the space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Anyway, I'll let you know if I come up with something.
Okay, great. Yeah, Bob?
Are you going to be putting this water on the evaporating coil of your air conditioner or compressor?
No, I'm not gonna, this will be my, excuse me, be my air conditioning. I will not incorporate I understand where you're going. If you cool the coil, the air conditioner draws less power, right?
Yeah, I did that, and I ended up a year later with with it completely encrusted with calcium deposits and had absolutely no air going through it. And I'm sitting there with vinegar day after day trying to get rid of that. So that doesn't work. Of course,
Well,
if you go back to the Roman times, dig a hole 6 foot down, put corrugated tubing in there, cover it up, and you get geothermal 56 degrees all year round and helps you heat and helps you cool.
Sure.
They didn't have air conditioning in the Roman times. Is that right, Jay? You remember that at all?
Yeah, I know. I'm not quite that old, but yeah. Well, I was thinking of a swamp fan, but of course, Houston's pretty humid, right? You don't want to be
Yes, it is.
blowing, if you were in Phoenix or something, no problem. You just use the moisture and blow air over it, you'll get the evaporative cooling. But in Houston, you'll probably just get mold on the wall and more humidity. So, yep. Check sources, non-industrialized countries. Yeah, that's an idea. Maybe if you look at some third world countries and see if they've got some options to take water from the creek and use it for cooling. That's option. Or you can bury your trailer under 6 feet of earth, then you'll get the ground cooling.
Right.
We have a root cellar like that, at our place that stays about 60 degrees all year long. So that works out quite nicely.
Mhm.
Anybody else have any suggestions or any other questions? Jay, you've got
Well,
a question?
Yeah, and I put something in the chat because just if this doesn't belong right here, can it? But with a congregation building that we've expanded, 96 panels, air heat exchangers, probably could put another 96 panels on it. And we are commercial electric, and we're getting killed because we draw power all day and put it in the grid, and we don't get much for it, and then need to run the system at night. So the two questions, one is batteries, how do you calculate in crude terms payback for if you just every day charge them and every night run them down? And the second is we got about a third of the, 20-some% for the original installation from prepaid SRECs from AEP in Ohio here. Do we follow that up if we start doing storage?
Yeah, the storage does qualify, I know, for the federal tax credit. Of course, this being a church, I don't know that that's a big issue because you're already nonprofit. But I don't know about the RECs. I would assume RECs still count for storage, but I don't know that for certain.
But AEP wouldn't ding us for running the current into the batteries instead of out to the grid.
No, because they don't know.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. What they're wanting is that the energy being consumed has been generated renewably. Now, whether
Okay.
you self-store or export, that's irrelevant as far as RECs are concerned. You just have to physically be connected to the grid. In other words, you're offsetting power that would have been coming from the grid with renewable. So
Right.
whether it's stored or not, doesn't matter. As far as the payback on it, I mean, you'd really need to know what's the difference between what you're getting paid for and what you're paying. That would be your costs associated with it that you're offsetting. And then there'd be the cost of the system, how long it's going to take to, how much it basically what you're talking about is self-consumption. And that's one of the reasons people are installing battery systems, is because the utilities are setting up pricing structures where either because of time of day pricing, where when you need the power, it's more expensive, and when you're generating the power, it's less expensive. So you're not being compensated one-to-one, or they're not paying you full retail for everything you're exporting back, which sounds like is your situation. And so self-consumption is a thing. It just hasn't been a thing in the past because batteries were too expensive. So the numbers are there. My guess is you'll find it's economically viable. Question is, again, you're going to have your cost up front as opposed to paying for it over time. And do you have the financial resources to do that? So,
Thanks.
yep. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think we're done. So we'll see you guys all next week. Enjoy the heat of the summer. And Devanan, let us know what you figure out on yours.
Yeah, well.
Okay, thanks a lot. See you guys later. Bye-bye.